Good morning, everyone. My name is Sunny Robles, and I am a 2L at the Duncan School of Law. Our first presenter of the day is Attorney Russell Fowler. Attorney Fowler is the Director of Litigation and Advocacy at the Legal Aid of East Tennessee. A graduate of the University of Memphis, he has been an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga since 1999. Attorney Fowler has many publications on law and legal history, including for the Smithsonian Institution, the ABA, the Journal of the Supreme Court History, and the Tennessee Bar Association. So without further ado, here is Attorney Fowler. You take it away. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Let me share my screen so I can get my PowerPoint. All right. Hope you can see the PowerPoint there. Thank you for having me. Every year, the bar nationally celebrates Law Day, and that's May the 1st. And every year the theme is chosen by the American Bar Association. Law Day's been going on since the 1950s, was created by a proclamation of President Eisenhower to educate, to instill respect for and understanding of the rule of law. And it's grown in importance throughout the decades to where it's not just recognized and celebrated on one day. You'll see bar associations and law schools having events from now through May. And so sort of consider this part of our Law Day celebrations. I want to talk about the development of constitutionalism. The Law Day theme this year is toward a more perfect union. And constitutionalism, as we know, is not frozen in stone. Constitutions change, they develop, they're amended, they're interpreted in different ways. We, in our studying American government and studying constitutional history, we often look back on what were the influences upon the founders. Of course, they had very classical educations. They were very familiar with the history of Greece and Rome, and cited to it often in the Federalist Papers and in their debates at the Constitutional Convention. But there were other influences as well. And part of those influences was historical development. So I want to talk about the legal historical developments that impacted our Constitution and how it developed and how it continues to develop. Yeah, our Zoom has a little time travel button. We have a high-tech Zoom here. And so we've gone back in time to medieval England. It's not a time of democracy, of course. It's a time of rulers. In the early Middle Ages, they were far from absolute rulers. They ruled over disconnected kingdoms throughout the island of Great Britain. The law was little and rarely enforced. In reality, might made right in this period of the early Middle Ages, the time of Beowulf. So let's take a look at all the law there was in the Middle Ages, and we'll see how this will lead to affect our constitutionalism. Now, historians today do not like to use the term the Dark Ages about the Middle Ages, and I get that. They point to that there was great development of culture, of music, of arts, architecture, and that's all true. It is misleading to call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, except if you're talking about the law. If you're talking about the law, I think the Dark Ages is a very apt description of the time. And so let's talk about all the law there was in medieval England. One institution of law was the hue and cry. Hue and cry. Hue means cry, and cry means you. If you're a lawyer, you'll learn why use one word when two will do. So, and they use two. It was an instrument of law enforcement and adjudication and punishment. And this is how it worked. If someone saw that a crime had been committed, then it was obligatory on them. They were required to give out the hue and cry. So if you saw someone mug someone else, if you saw someone steal a sheep, as in our picture there, you had a duty to give out the hue and cry. You put out a cry, and then the others in the community are obliged to join you in the chase of the culprit. When the culprit was caught, then it was perfectly legal. No, it was perfectly required that the culprit be executed. Now, you didn't have much complaints about the slowness of the judicial process then. And the hue and cry was very popular. You got to remember the lives of most folk in the medieval England was pretty drab. And to hear the hue and cry, the chance to get together and chase down a criminal and kill them, was kind of fun. But there were limitations to this. If the culprit was faster than the crowd, and made it to the shire line, like the county line, and crossed it, then the chasers, those giving out the hue and cry, had to stop the chase. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty good for the culprit, but not really. No matter how slow, how old, how lumbering the crowd was chasing the culprit, no matter how fast he or she may have been, when he crossed the shire line, then it is the duty of the inhabitants of the next shire to pick up the chase, sort of like a human baton in a relay race. So eventually, in theory at least, the culprit is caught. Now, it's not a very civilized method of law enforcement and punishment, but it was efficient, and the people liked it a lot. But there was also probably setups, people giving out the hue and cry on innocent people. Another institution of law was the blood feud. It is perfectly legal if someone killed a member of your family that you could kill the killer. But it was also perfectly legal for then the killer's family to kill you. And it becomes a vicious cycle of death for death that would literally, records show, go on for generations and could about wipe out whole families. But it was perfectly legal. Then, as we move deeper into the Middle Ages, we see the rise of an alternative system. It originally is offered as an alternative to the blood feud, and then it later becomes obligatory, required. You have to accept this system. So, if someone killed a member of your family, then you are entitled originally to go for the blood feud or to accept payment of money, compensation for the value of that person. And in each of the kingdoms, there is a list of the value of each member of society, not by name, but by rank, all the way up to the king. And the amount for the life of the king is so high that no one could ever afford it. Now, this compensation with money, again, is an option, and but it does put an end to the violence. Also, and it's called the ware-gil, which means man money. There is also a bot system that is, if you injure someone, you're entitled to a certain amount of money, a bot, B-O-T, for that body part. So there's so much set for a right eye, so much set for a left eye, for a left arm, a right arm, a leg, etc. Sort of looks like a cannibal's menu. And so if you put out someone's eye, then you will pay a set amount. Now, if you didn't pay the amounts, if you could pay the amounts, then you were declared an outlaw. And many could not pay the amounts and fled into the forest. You got to remember that England has vast forests, such as Sherwood Forest, and they were filled with outlaws, those who couldn't afford to pay the weregild or the bond. So Robin Hood and his merry men might not have been so merry. And the reason is this. Anytime you run into an outlaw, someone put outside the protection of the law, then it was perfectly legal for you to kill them. Perfectly appropriate. And you could assume that anyone in the forest was an outlaw. In fact, as you approached different English villages in the Middle Ages, you would come upon a post at the road as you enter the village, and hanging from a rope on the post is a horn. And you better blow that horn. That's announcing that you are entering the village and you are not an outlaw. And if you didn't, then if they assumed you were an outlaw, then they could kill you. As we move on into the Middle Ages, we see the development of early judicial institutions. And they're very dependent upon the intervention of God. And you've got to remember, this is a very, very religious or pious time. And during these proceedings, a churchman had to always be present. So let's look at these institutions. One is trial by ordeal. That is where an individual is subject to an ordeal, and what we are doing is asking for the intervention of God to tell us if the accused is guilty or not. And there were three forms of trial by ordeal. One was submersion. That is, you take an individual, you tie them up, you throw them in a river or stream. If they sink into the water, then they are not guilty because the pure waters have accepted them. If they float, they're guilty and can be punished. Another ordeal is having to carry a red hot iron. They make you carry it for so many seconds, then they wrap the hand and they come back a few days later. If it's healing properly, then you're innocent. If it's festering, if it's infected, then you're guilty. Similarly, they might force the accused to plunge their arm into boiling water. They wrap it, come back a few days later. If it's healing nicely, they're not guilty. If it's festering, then they're guilty and punished. We also see the development of what we call compurgation. This is for the upper classes. If you are accused of a crime and you're a member of the upper classes, then you will come to court. Now, courts are a very local affair, dominated by the local baron or lord, and you bring witnesses to court. And you say, well, that's a big step forward. Well, maybe not. The witnesses come to court and they recite a preset pledge or oath, and they're called oath helpers. And they recite the oath that the accused is a good person and their word can be accepted and they should be believed. These witnesses may know absolutely nothing about the alleged crime or what happened. They're not expected to, and no one wants to hear what they have to say. They simply recite the pre-prescribed oath. And you've got to bring in a certain number, such as 12 oath helpers. Now you say, well, that's pretty easy to get off the crime. Well, maybe not. Because the court's not interested in what the oath helpers have to say. The court's more interested in how they say it. If they, in reciting the prescribed oath, if they stammer, or if they misspeak, or as they would say, their tongue tripped, then they would say God calls them to misspeak, and the accused is guilty. Now, these first institutions I've talked about are in the Anglo-Saxon period. Then in 1066, we get the Norman conquest, and the Normans bring along another judicial type of proceeding, and that's trial by battle, where the contestants fight it out to see who was guilty or not. They would say that God had intervened to cause the victor to win. In civil cases, you could use a champion if you like. Well, the common people didn't like this. With the other institutions of law, they could envision that God had intervened. But with trial by battle, it was obvious that this guy's bigger than that guy. That's why he won. So it wasn't really liked by the masses. They liked the trial by ordeal, but they didn't like trial by battle. But the Normans liked it because it expressed their liking for chivalry, for courage. But the common people didn't like it. They also didn't like it because it's just too French. As we move into the Middle Ages, in England, we go into a period of a great civil war to where that rages for a generation. And out of this chaos between two claimants to the English throne, we get a new king, a young king, the first Plantagenet king, Henry II, in 1154. He is young, he is educated, and as we will see, he will look at this legal system in England and say, this is ridiculous. So let's talk a minute about Henry II. He is the greatest of the English medieval kings, and his achievements are awesome. And as we will see, he will put us on the road to constitutionalism. One thing he does is to slowly undermine these barbaric institutions of law. He will create his own national court system with his own judges, which will fan out across the land and learn the best customs and write them down and create the first law book. And these customs, these accepted rules will be the best, will be applied nationwide. And as they decide cases and write down how the cases are decided, they will be a guide to how future cases are decided, or what we call stare decisis. And what we see being born here is what we know as the common law, a common law applicable to the whole country. We will see with the development of courts, the development of professional judges and bar, professional prosecutors. We will see the development of the writ system. Before Henry, a writ is a court order. Before Henry, writs, court orders requiring someone to do something or not to do something or to require an investigation of something, these court orders were very rare and usually only available to the rich and powerful. Henry makes the writ system open to everyone. For a small fee, someone could go to his chancery, the great secretariat of his government, and obtain a writ to investigate whether this wrong has been done or if this person owns this piece of land. And to show Henry's interest in the common people, he even creates the writ of libertate probanda. That is a writ to discover if a serf should be set free. Serfdom is similar to slavery in that lower class folk were bound to the land they worked. So if you bought this piece of land, you got the workers that worked it. Henry opens up the system of his very powerful government to where even the lowliest serf could come in and request a writ of libertate probanda to have it determine whether or not they should be freed from serfdom. So what he is doing is opening up government to everyone, and that is a significant step on the road to constitutionalism. Now, earlier kings had suggested some of these reforms, but none were able to achieve them. Henry was the greatest power in 1,000 years. He ruled England, he ruled half of France. He had the power to achieve what others had only dreamed about. And also under Henry, we see the development of trial by jury. Originally, it's an option. and he slowly makes it to where it is obligatory. The first jury, called the Clarendon jury, will become the grand jury. It would determine whether or not someone would have to go through the ordeal. Subsequent, we will see the development of a second jury, a petit jury or trial jury, which would take the place of the ordeal. So we see the rise of trial by jury under Henry. Now, where did he get this from? The concept of a jury is rooted in the royal inquest. When William the Conqueror took over England, the most famous royal inquest took place. He did a great inventory of everything in England. He wanted to know what he had conquered, what he owed. And so he sent his officials across the country to compile a great catalog or inventory. And it's known as the Doomsday Book, and it still exists. And that book categorizes not only the land, but every sheep and every cow. Well, in deciding who owned what piece of land, sometimes these officials had to adjudicate because there would be more than one claimant to that piece of land. Now, royal inquest, this was the great royal inquest, the Doomsday Book was the most famous. And Doomsday Book sounds pretty ominous, but doom means not the end of the world in this sense. It means law or court, a doom. And there had been other royal inquests when one baron had a dispute with another over a piece of land, then the king might send his officials out to do a royal inquest. Well, Henry makes these inquests permanent and open to everyone. And that is the development of our jury system, in that in deciding cases, deciding who owns land, you would bring people together from the community to say, well, Farmer Green has always owned this land. Well, in the beginning, you wanted people who knew the facts of the case, but over time, that became irrelevant. You would bring people in to decide whether they should be subject to the ordeal. And then we have a second jury to decide whether they're guilty or not guilty. So trial by jury develops out of this investigatory tool of the Middle Ages, originally used for the rich and powerful, but then made available to all. And so Henry has put us on the road to constitutionalism. Now, his son, King John, he's the evil Prince John from all the Robin Hood movies, he becomes king. And he is not as good a king as his father. He does not appreciate the improvements and the court system that his father has created. And the barons have come who originally didn't like Henry's system. They're losing power. They're losing control of their local courts. They have begun to like this very fair, predictable, reliable legal system. And so when John starts to undermine it by closing courts or requiring courts to render judgments in his favorite's favor, they resent this. And that is one of the reasons that they rebel against John. They are wanting to protect the legal system created by his father. And among the things that John agrees to at Runnymede when he is cornered outside Windsor by his barons in 1215 is that he agrees to no one will we sell, to no one will we refuse or delay right or justice. What we are seeing here is the rise of the rule of law. And it's an amazing thing, not happening anywhere else in the Western world. Power had always been in the hands of the powerful. Now there's something gaining the power, the majesty, the respect other than the king, and that is the law itself, ergo the rule of law. In Magna Carta, it states, to no free man shall we be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights of possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. What we have here is due process, a recognition that there is something higher than the king. There's something more powerful than who happens to be the most powerful. There is the law, Magna Carta. Now, in modern times today, a lot of historians are very cynical. They look for ulterior motives, that people don't just do things because it's right, or they just don't do things because it's noble or patriotic or just. And so a lot of historians point to the barons and say it was just a petty grievance. The barons were looking out for themselves. When they wanted to guarantee a trial by jury of their peers, they were simply making sure that only barons could try barons, and that it was just a temporary peace treaty. That Magna Carta was a temporary peace treaty among greedy barons against a greedy king. Well, I think it was a lot more than that. I think they thought it was a lot more than that, because all future kings had to swear to uphold Magna Carta. And in modern times, they were excavating, archaeologists, the Indiana Jones of our day, were excavating a chapel from the Middle Ages from the period of the lives of these barons. And in excavating this chapel, they came across the tomb of one of the barons at Runnymede. And so they find this giant sarcophagus, and they scrape the dust off and use their brushes or whatever to read what's written across the top of the lid to the sarcophagus. And what it says is Magna Carta est lex deinde caveat rex. Magna Carta is the law, and the king better beware. They were stunned, because what this is saying is this was not a little temporary peace treaty. This was not barons simply looking out for themselves. This is something a lot more, that the law is now supreme. The law rules. We see over time in the later Middle Ages the development of different, more sophisticated courts, and one that develops over time is chancery court. Now, I mentioned when Henry invented the writ system, if you wanted a writ, a court order to begin the judicial process, you went to chancery, the great secretariat of the government, and paid a fee, and a writ would issue. Well, over time, as we move through the Middle Ages, as with all bureaucracies, the writ system did not respond to the changing needs of society. As we move through the Middle Ages, as we get closer to the Renaissance, we see the development of trade and new types of business relationships, corporations, partnerships, insurance agreements. But the writ system was designed mainly to deal with land disputes, which was the main source of wealth in the Middle Ages. But as we see new kinds of wealth and new kinds of entrepreneurial relationships, the law proved inadequate. The legal system, the common law courts, would not respond. And its main remedy when you sued in court was money damages, relating all the way back to the old bot-ware guild system. That if you sued someone, all you could get was money. Well, sometimes money alone is inadequate. It's an adequate remedy of law. And therefore, new remedies were needed. For example, if you're Farmer Brown and you're downstream from Farmer Green, and Farmer Green builds a dam across the stream and shuts off the water to your farm, you go sue in court. The court gives you a money judgment. That doesn't do you any good. You need the dam removed. You've got a money judgment. He doesn't have any money to collect. So what does someone do? Where does someone go if the legal system won't give them a remedy? They started out going to the king And the king might order Farmer Green to take away the dam. Well, so many new types of requests for legal assistance came to the king that he didn't want to deal with anymore. And he shoved it off on his chief minister, the Lord Chancellor. And what we will see over time is the development of a new body of law within the common law known as equity. Originally, he would send these petitions to his council, the Curia Regis. It was then sent to the Lord Chancellor, and over time, the Lord Chancellor developed his own court sitting in Westminster Hall, which still stands. And eventually, in the Renaissance period, a chancellor comes along named Thomas More, and he develops a body of law for equity. So you have two systems of courts. You have the common law courts, and you have the chancery court or court of equity that will fashion a judgment as required when the law courts were not able to respond. And that's why today in Tennessee, for example, or in Delaware or in Mississippi, you still have separate courts of law and equity, circuit court and chancery court. As we move down this road of constitutionalism, we come up upon Richard III. We know for our English majors, you know Richard III, the evil Richard III in Shakespeare, and he was a pretty bad dude. But as we also know, a lot of folks aren't all bad or all good, and he had some good in him too, we think, because even with the development of chancery court, with the development of the writ system, over time, the poor were still shut out. And he created a court designed simple, easy to access for the poor, called the Court of Requests. And it survived. His reign didn't survive very long, but his court did. And it's the forerunner of our small claims courts, or our general sessions courts. We see that the common law comes to be seen as an inherent right of all Englishmen. Sir Edward Coke, one of the great judges of the Elizabethan period, said, "The common law is the best and most common birthright that the subject hath for the safeguarded defense not only of his goods, lands, and revenues, but of his wife and children, his body, fame, and life also." With the English Civil War, we finally get established that there is something higher than the king. The king's power is not absolute. And after much effort and subsequently a revolution of sorts, in 1689, we get the English Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights does a lot of things, but it reflects the belief in the common law and due process, and guarantees certain fundamental rights that will be protected and that cannot be infringed upon by the king. It also reflects a new philosophy of Hobbes and Locke, particularly John Locke, who was a great friend of Lord John Somers, who wrote the English Bill of Rights. And in that is the concept that government is a contract between the people and the ruler. And if the ruler breaches that contract, then the people have a right to rebel or to revolution. And you can see why the framers of the American Constitution, who had just gone through a revolution, find John Locke so inviting, because he in effect says what in the past would be illegal, to rebel against your king, is now perfectly legal, perfectly even just and right and obligatory, because the king has breached the contract of government. The king, you give up certain rights and the king gives you certain protections. And if the king does not do so, then you have the right and the obligation to rebel. The English come to America and bring with them the common law legal system and the belief that comes with it in the rule of law, in limited government, and the concept of writing things down. And when you start writing down rights and responsibilities, your next thought is how to expand them. Now, yes, what the common law system that the British bring to America, they simplify, they make it more egalitarian and more accessible. For example, I want to mention Margaret Brent. She is the first woman to argue a case in a court of common law that we know of anywhere, and it took place in Maryland. She was not a lawyer. She could not have been. Women were not licensed to be lawyers, but she was a very wealthy property owner, and she insisted on representing herself. And the court allowed her. And she was so darn good at it when the governor Calvert, who was the proprietor, practically the owner of Maryland, he left instructions in his will that he wanted her to be the executor of the estate because he knew that when he died, there would be a lot of litigation over all his different lands and properties, and he wanted her to be the executor of the estate to represent his interests. With the coming of the Revolution, one of the more important revolutionaries is John Adams of Boston, and he writes a number of pamphlets defending what would become revolution. And what he basically argues is that the rights guaranteed in Magna Carta, the rights guaranteed in the English Bill of Rights are being violated. The revolution does not begin with the revolutionaries seeking a revolution. It begins with what would become revolutionaries simply seeking the rights of all English people. And it snowballs in time to something much more. There are many causes of the American Revolution, but one of the important causes is the Administration of Justice Act of 1774. The king, through Parliament, undermines completely many of the common law legal rights of the colonists in an effort to get control of the situation. And all it does is fuel the anger, the rebellion, in that people feel, see, here's proof. George III is trying to take away our rights as Englishmen. These rights, these common law rights, the rights of Magna Carta, the rights of the English Bill of Rights. And it is one of the taking away of these legal rights is one of the main engines that drives the rebellion. And so we get to the Declaration of Independence. Now, when we think about the Declaration of Independence, we think about its lofty language, that all men are created equal and that the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Yes, 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 the great mission statement of America. And it's important, it's critical. But the drafters of the Declaration of Independence spent most of their time, most of their debate, focusing not prospectively on the mission statement in there of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They are looking backwards, retrospectively, at the violations of the king and justifying the separation, justifying revolution. And one of those things listed among the long list of offenses was for depriving us, in many cases, of trial by jury. These rights of English men and women to be tried by jury. And the Declaration of Independence is set up very much like an indictment. It's an indictment of the king, a bill of particulars, listing his offenses, listing his violations of the law. As Thomas Jefferson said, the wisdom of our sages and the blood of our heroes has been devoted to the attainment of trial by jury. It should be the creed of our political faith. He also said that the right to trial by jury is even more important than the right to vote. So what are we highlighting here? The importance to the framers, to the founders, of these common law legal rights developed in England were just as important to them as these broader discussions of no taxation without representation, the right to vote, the right to choose your representative, etc. One of the things they were really focused on was their legal rights that they thought they inherited as being a part of England. In the original constitutions, the states, after independence is declared, are told to draft new state constitutions. And as we look at the Massachusetts Constitution, we see a guarantee in civil suits, the parties have a right to trial by jury, and this method of procedure shall be held sacred. We're not just talking about trial by jury in criminal defenses, we're also talking about the sacred right to trial by jury in civil cases. And so we come upon the Constitution. The Constitution is the great nation-forging document. And again, much of its goal is to preserve the heritage of the English legal system, or the common law legal system. They spent a lot of time talking about the presidency, a new institution created from scratch, a Congress, a bicameral Congress, a new institution. They spent very little time on the court system. Why is that? Article 3 is very short compared to the other articles. Article 1 dealing with Congress, Article 2 dealing with the executive branch, but Article 3 is very short, like one paragraph, very short paragraph. It's because they were so familiar with courts. They weren't designing a new system. The courts, they had inherited a court system. They weren't creating a new system. And so that's why they spent so little time on courts. They also recognized that change would be necessary. They didn't claim to be demigods. They didn't claim to be able to write a document that would be perfect for all ages to come. As George Washington said, there's a constitutional door open for change. I think the people can decide on the alterations and amendments which time may prove necessary. The framers also knew that the document was not perfect. They very well knew the contradiction of slavery to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Franklin was very much an anti-slavery person, a leader in the anti-slavery movement. But he knew this is all their generation could get and be able to pull the states together, or as they said, to make 13 clocks chime as one. He said, the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. However, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of this convention would with me on this occasion doubt a little of his own infallibility, and to make manifest our unanimity, put his name to this instrument. John Adams said, this is a government of laws and not of men. But soon it was amended in the ways that Washington said, and that it wasn't perfect. Now, James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, the original 10 amendments. Basically, it was amended somewhat. And the focus here is on civil liberties, protection of the liberties of the individual. Now, why did Madison originally not want a Bill of Rights? He thought that the system designed in the Constitution, with its separation of powers, with its checks and balances, with federalism, that the system would protect rights, and that when you start listing rights, you endanger those not listed. But he was a practical politician, and he saw that in order to get the Constitution ratified, he had to agree to a Bill of Rights, which in many respects mirrors the English Bill of Rights in some ways. And it is adopted. Its focus is on protecting the liberties of the individual. We also see, as Hamilton said, laws are a dead letter without courts to expound and define their true meaning and operation. And we see that the debate will now move, especially when we get John Marshall, to the powers of courts. Courts do not control the purse, they do not control the sword. And we see these Article 3 courts originally given very little attention. get a lot of attention. We also see that the common law legal system spreads across the frontier to Tennessee and other places in the Northwest and the Southwest, and with it goes the English common law, the common law system. And I want to end with one of these frontier lawyers, William Tatum of Knoxville. He was a young lawyer. He had fought in the Revolution. He was friends of Thomas Jefferson. He was friends of James Madison. He took part with Alexander Hamilton in the last charge at Yorktown. And he points out the importance, the critical importance of access to justice by the powerless. And in that, he runs an ad in the Knoxville newspaper in 1793, basically saying he will not turn a deaf ear to anyone because they cannot pay for a lawyer, or he will not turn a deaf ear to anyone who is in bondage. And we see the importance here is the common law is a very important part of constitutionalism. It's more than simply the right to vote, the right to have representation. It includes a whole lot more, the English heritage. And that is why the Constitution makes clear that there are rights other than those listed in the Bill of Rights. And among those rights are the common law rights. All right, I will end there and see if there's any questions.
So yes, thank you so much. We have two questions. I'll ask the first one. So the first one says, of all the leaders you discussed, who do you see as the most influential on the original U.S. Constitution?
Well, that one's pretty easy for me, and that's Madison. Madison prepared the Virginia Plan, which set the agenda at the Constitutional Convention. He wrote the original draft of the Bill of Rights. So James Madison wins that one pretty easily. But it could not have happened, I do not believe, if Washington had not supported it. Washington was not the great thinker that Madison was, but everyone on both sides, the left and the right, it's hard to imagine today. We're so polarized today between left and right, Republican and Democrat. We're so CNN versus Fox News. To imagine that there's someone that both extremes trust completely, that's hard to imagine. Yet they did, George Washington. And I think he was key to making it all happen.
Alrighty, thank you so much. So the next question I'll read from Brandon, and this is all new to me and extremely interesting. I appreciate you speaking today. I am wondering what the closest model of court today is similar to a chancery court. Perhaps one in effort to make equitable decisions and take in account what is needed as reparations.
Well, there are still chancery courts, courts of equity, separate and apart from the regular law courts in 3 states. That's Tennessee, Delaware, and Mississippi. But the other states, that doesn't mean they don't have equity. They have merged their law and equity courts, often called district courts. But these courts are, when I say equity, it doesn't mean they can simply do what they think is right. They are bound by rules and guides and procedures, just like the law courts, of when they can intervene and when they can act. And usually the most powerful equitable remedy is the injunction. That's an order to require someone to do something or not to do something. But all the states have equitable powers, but you got to keep in mind, that's not just set free to do whatever they think is right. From the time of Thomas More, who laid down rules of equity, it is fenced in, it is guided, has limitations.
If anyone else has any questions, please either raise your hand or put it in the Q&A box. I have a question regarding witnesses. So I know you stated that prior, the witnesses weren't really there to say what happened. They were there to say the oath. And then if they stumbled on the oath, then we would have an issue because obviously God mandated. But I want to know when we made, if you know, when did we make the jump from, okay, saying the oath to now the witnesses actually saying what they saw or what happened or the credibility of the defendant?
That's a very good question. That is another achievement of Henry II. You know, he doesn't get the attention. He's called the father of the common law, but he doesn't get the attention he deserves. What he achieved is phenomenal. Changes like this would normally take centuries to develop in those times. He did this during his reign. What happens originally, his first grand jury, called the Clarendon jury, because he created it with a decree from his hunting lodge at Clarendon, originally it decided who would go to the ordeal. Okay. Subsequently, he comes up with a different trial jury that instead of the ordeal, a trial jury, or what they called a petit jury, or that small jury, would hear evidence. You now have the assertion in not a belief in divine intervention, but a belief in human reason. And we see this development during his reign. By the end of his reign, you have witnesses coming into court and testifying, being asked questions by a lawyer before a trial jury. And the trial jury will decide who it believes. And you have to give Henry the credit for this. This is all his doing. And why? Why? Historians look for cynical reasons or economic motives. I think he was just a good person. Sometimes the answer is just that simple.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions? Alrighty, so before we close, can you give us more information where we can find out more about your work?
Well, I write articles in the Tennessee Bar Journal in a column called History's Verdict, and they are online, Tennessee Bar Journal articles. I can suggest some books to you. If you like to learn more about this medieval development of the law, there's a book, it's hard to get, but I'm sure you can find it used somewhere cheaply. It's called The Law of the Land. The Law of the Land by Charles Rembar, Rembar. And you can probably find it in paperback, used online at Amazon or somewhere. That's a very good book. Another important thing to read, which you may have already read or read parts of it, is the Federalist Papers. It is, keep in mind, it is not an academic writing. It is not written for scholars. It is written for everyday people to explain the Constitution and try to convince the people to support it. But it's written in the language of the 1780s, and that can be a challenge. And I found this: the first time you read it, it's hard. The second time you read it, you're more used to their way of, and it makes a whole lot more sense. Every time you read it, it gets clearer and clearer. The trick is read the parts you want to read and come back and read them again. And the second time, I promise you, will be a lot clearer.
Well, I want to thank you so much for making time. It was definitely an interesting discussion. I truly enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone who made time.